And I was the one on this committee that one of the nominees actually apologized to, not for what I did, but what he said. And I want to get at some of the criticisms that we have heard lodged against this great woman. When we hear about this child pornography, what I see a mom who opened up her heart to all of us and explained to all of us how no one can be the perfect mom, no matter how hard you try. I see a woman of deep faith who was questioned about that and explained her deep faith many, many times. Let's look at the facts. In 8 of the 11 child pornography cases that Judge Jackson handled, she gave a sentence at or above either the probation office recommendations. And when she imposed other sentences, it was because she looked at the case carefully. And by the way, she made her own decision. Maybe not everyone in this room would have agreed with it, but she was being a judge. Just like judges that were supported by my colleagues made that decision. I'm not even going to mention these judges' names that I'm about to talk about, because I don't think they should be dragged into this just because they happen to make decisions that were below guidelines. One of them on the Second Circuit, strongly supported by one of our colleagues and commended, said when he sentenced a defendant to 60 months, he sentenced a defendant to 60 months, which was 60% lower than the bottom of the guideline range at 151 months. Another one who was complimented on the 11th Circuit by our Republican colleagues, he sentenced a defendant to 84 months, which was 44% lower than the bottom of the guidelines. Here's some Trump nominees. One in the Eastern District of Missouri, who's a judge, sentenced a defendant to 60 months when the guideline range was 135 to 168. Another Trump nominee that was supported by our colleagues, Eastern District of Missouri, sentenced a defendant to 60 months when the guideline range was 78 to 97 months. Another, I will not go on, but they could all have been dragged through the mud too. They could have been dragged through the mud and called names with these kinds of implications. Last week, the committee received a letter from a former federal child exploitation prosecutor in the District of Columbia who wrote that Judge Jackson, quote, had a reputation for carefully considering the circumstances of every case, and that former and current prosecutors note that she was thoughtful and individualized in her approach to these cases. And if you really want to go deep into the details here, Senator Cruz released a chart saying the average sentence imposed by Judge Jackson in possession cases, possession of porn, is 29.3 months. But it is on only 4 cases and omits one that would raise her average to 52 months, much closer to the reported national average of 60 months. And if you were considering all of her non-production cases, possession, receipt, distribution of pornography, and yes, as a former prosecutor, I know these differences, average sentence imposed was 65 months. I literally cannot even believe that I'm going into these details, but I am. Last, when we hear about judicial philosophy, let me quote Judge Roberts in his own hearing. He said, well, I have said I do not have an overarching judicial philosophy. I think we heard this great judge and how she's going to decide cases. She's going to decide cases with fairness, and she's going to do the best thing, and she's going to look at the facts, and she's going to look at the law, and she's going to make a decision. She recognizes, as she told me at her hearing, that public confidence in the court is crucial. That's why she's always written such long and transparent decisions to explain to the public her reasoning. She told me about her deep commitment to judicial independence. When I asked her about stare decisis, she said that if there were massive shifts every time a new justice came on or every time new circumstances arose, there would be a concern that public confidence would be eroded. As she put it, stare decisis, looking at the past cases, I'm just paraphrasing that, furthers the rule of law in this country. She is someone that understands and has shown her ability to take on complex matters. But just as importantly, she's someone who understands the real-world impact of court's decision. She understands that those words on the page aren't just words. Those words on the page can change people's lives, whether they can get health care, what their options are, if they can have clean water and air, even if they're going to be able to vote, when they're going to be able to vote, and how they're going to be able to vote. At this critical moment in our history, Judge Jackson has the qualities to make sure that the court and the Constitution, in Justice Breyer's words, work for the people of today. She will bring to the court her rich experience as a judge, a working mom, a family member who has law enforcement, a child of teachers, a former public defender, and a deeply committed public servant. Her story is a quintessentially American one. And as she put it, her success is, quote, a testament to the hope and promise of this country. Now, it is our duty as senators on this committee to take on that hope and promise of America. And remember, as this day moves forward, and as we hear from our colleagues, and we take this vote, that this is all about that spirit of hope and promise. And let's make Maddie Morgan proud. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are more consequential decisions the Senate undertakes or this committee undertakes than the nomination and confirmation of Supreme Court justices. Judge Jackson is charming. She's talented. She has an inspiring life story. If she's confirmed, she will be an historic first, the first African-American woman to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. I've known Judge Jackson for 30 years. I've always liked her personally. But the assessment this body is charged with the Constitution with making is whether her records demonstrate she will be a justice who will faithfully uphold the Constitution. Now, our Democratic colleagues and their cheerleaders in the corporate media have repeatedly tried to suggest that any opposition to Judge Jackson's nomination is rooted in racism or sexism. There's some irony in that, because all of the Democrats on this committee were only so happy to vote against the confirmation of Justice Amy Coney Barrett without facing any concerns about the sexism they were showing. And there's greater irony in Democrats celebrating this historic first, because it would have occurred 20 years ago. An African-American woman could have served on the Supreme Court 20 years ago, except for the fact that Democrats filibustered a qualified African-American woman, Judge Janice Rogers Brown. Indeed, if members of this committee were asked to raise your hand, have you ever filibustered a qualified African-American woman in order to prevent her from going to the U.S. Supreme Court? 3 hands would go up. Not on this side of the aisle, but the 3 most senior Democrats would all be obliged to raise their hand. Also, Joe Biden, if he's at home watching this on C-SPAN, Joe Biden would raise his hand as well. Chuck Schumer would raise his hand as well. So this historic first could have happened a decade ago, but for the unified partisan opposition of Democrats to letting it happen with a judge who was not on the hard left. A number of Democrats complained that there were hard questions asked. Well, that's our responsibility. Every one of the questions focused on her record as a judge, her sentencing record, her academic writings, her speeches to law schools. Not a single Republican senator asked her about her high school yearbook, engaged in the kind of personal slanders that Democrats have made a business about. If the questions were hard, it is because her record is at the extreme. There have been 115 men and women who have served on the Supreme Court. If Judge Jackson is confirmed, I believe she will prove to be the most extreme and the furthest left justice ever to serve on the United States Supreme Court. She will be to the left of Justice Sotomayor. She will be to the left of Justice Kagan. She will be way, way, way to the left of Justice Stephen Breyer. That's why radical leftist groups have pledged to spend over $1 million supporting her nomination while they demanded the Biden White House pick the furthest left, the most extreme nominee. That's their agenda. Now, our Democratic colleagues like to pretend they don't support the agenda this justice can be predicted to follow. Based on her record, if she is confirmed, I think the odds are virtually 100% that she will vote to overturn Heller versus District of Columbia, which means she will vote to overturn, to take away the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms of every individual. If she is confirmed, the odds are virtually 100% she will vote to overturn the Citizens United case, which means she will vote to take away the free speech rights of Americans to participate in the political process. If she is confirmed, the odds are nearly 100% she will vote to strike down every single reasonable restriction on abortion across the country. That includes restrictions on partial birth abortion. That includes requirements for parental notification or consent. If she is confirmed, the odds are nearly 100% she will vote to overturn efforts to enforce our nation's borders and to deport those here illegally. The Make the Road case demonstrated her willingness to put left-wing policy above the law. If she is confirmed, the odds are over 100% she will vote to give away U.S. sovereignty to international tribunals and international bodies. If she is confirmed, the odds are overwhelming she will vote to undermine our religious liberty and to overturn decisions like Zellman versus Simmons-Harris, the 5-4 landmark decision that upheld school choice. Understand the consequence of this nomination. If she is confirmed, the odds are very, very high she will vote to throw out school choice programs all across this country. And then there's crime. No topic has been the focus of this hearing more than her record on crime, and her record on crime is out of the mainstream. Her record on crime is extreme. Now, our Democratic colleagues have responded with a straw man. They've responded saying, well, judges all over the country sentence below the guidelines. When you look at her record, it's not just below the guidelines, though. In 100% of the child pornography cases where Judge Jackson had discretion, 100%, she sentenced not just below the guidelines, but below where the prosecutor asked, and usually substantially below. But my colleagues say everybody does it. That's their defense. Everybody does it. Well, let's look at the facts. In criminal cases nationally, this is all criminal cases nationally. If you compare Judge Jackson's record in criminal cases nationally, her average sentence is 29.9 months. The national average is 45.1 months. So that's all crimes, murder, rape, anything that's a crime, all of them on the national statistics. She sentences a third lower than the national average. The Democrats' argument, everybody does it, doesn't stand up to the scrutiny. But when you look in particular at child pornography, a topic that is disturbing, the Democrats say, well, gosh, she doesn't like child pornography. Of course she doesn't. No rational person does. It's horrible. My Democratic colleagues go to the Senate floor and they read from her statements talking about these are not victimless crimes. These are little boys and little girls being horribly, violently assaulted. It stays with them their whole lives. I agree with what she says, but she says that and then turns around and gives the defendant, the criminal, a slap on the wrist. And if you look at the records, possession of child pornography, the national average is 68 months. That's every federal district judge in the country. What is Judge Jackson's average? 29.2 months. She sentences 57% lower than the national average, 57%. Even more disturbing, distribution. The national average for distributing child porn, videos of little children being sexually assaulted, the national average is 135 months. 11 years. That's a long sentence because it's a horrible crime. Her average is 71.9 months. That's 47% less, but this is even more striking when you realize that the mandatory minimum for distributing child porn is 60 months. That under federal law, you can't go below 60 months. What that means is that judges across the country on average sentence those distributing child porn to 75 months longer than the mandatory minimum. And Judge Jackson sentences them on average to 11.9 months longer. Now, the Democrats suggest this is cherry picking. This is based on every single child pornography case she's decided. And by the way, we just last week after the hearing got information on another case, United States versus Weeks, of an individual who raped his 13-year-old niece. Judge Jackson sentenced him to half what the prosecutors wanted because he failed to register on a sex registry and went to work at a daycare. While he was released early because of Judge Jackson's sentence, he committed another sexual assault, a rape. Again, she had him before her, and again, she sentenced him to half what the prosecutors sought. This is a pattern. Now, Democratic senators like to say they don't want to abolish the police. But I'll tell you what, if Judge Jackson is confirmed, her record demonstrates that it is 100% certain she will vote to overturn the death penalty, and that repeatedly she will vote to overturn strict sentences on violent criminals, to release violent criminals from jail, to overturn strict punishments on sex offenders. And my Democratic colleagues like to say when crime is skyrocketing, when murder rates are skyrocketing, when carjacking is skyrocketing, when sexual assaults are skyrocketing, my Democratic colleagues say it's not my fault. Well, I'll tell you what. When you vote to confirm justices who release criminals over and over and over again in a way that is wildly out of the mainstream, it is the Democrats' fault.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley. Thank you for maintaining, to the extent you can, the decorum of these proceedings, a respectful process, and I am particularly grateful to President Biden for nominating Judge Jackson and to Judge Jackson for her courage and her engagement in this process, which at time has been withering, even abusive. I was impressed by the fact that she was raised by a family committed to service, that raised her with a sense of dignity and integrity and a very strong sense of self with which she carried herself through what have been some challenging moments here in this committee. I believe the majority of the members of this committee have made a good faith effort to learn about Judge Jackson and her record, and through hours of one-on-one meetings, an extensive review of her record, and hearing from organizations and advocates nationally, they've come away with a view where they are certain of her both outstanding character and impeccable qualifications. Anyone who watched these hearings saw Judge Jackson give a clinic on judicial temperament and how to conduct oneself in a poised and thoughtful way that I thought gave a voice through action of her impeccable character. To be sure, there have been a number of attacks lobbed at Judge Jackson, some of them really quite recently, and so I think some brief rejoinder may well be worth a few minutes of our time. Judge Jackson is not far from the mainstream. In fact, in over 250 reviews conducted by the American Bar Association, and that includes judges and prosecutors, defense attorneys, fellow practitioners from her time as a public defender, her time at different law firms, her time on the bench, and her clerkships, not one found her far outside the mainstream. Judge Jackson has nothing to do with critical race theory, despite a number of engaging posters. As she testified, and as the record shows, she's never cited or relied upon critical race theory in her 9 years on the bench and in her more than 570 written opinions. She is not a radical liberal activist judge, and I don't think any of us should be making proclamations about what we are certain she would do to the trajectory of American law. As all of us who were here for the first day remember, Republican-appointed conservative Judge Thomas Griffith from the D.C. Circuit testified in front of us that in Judge Jackson's 9 years on the district court bench and more than 570 opinions, she demonstrated a diligent and careful approach. As Judge Griffith told us, Judge Jackson is an independent jurist who adjudicates based on the facts and the law and not as a partisan. Judge Jackson is not soft on crime. I think it is particularly hard to square the fact that two of the largest, best informed, most active law enforcement advocacy organizations in our country, the National Fraternal Order of Police and the International Association of Chiefs of Police, have spoken up in support of her nomination. It is hard to square that with some of the mischaracterizations that have been lobbed in her direction. She is from a family dedicated to service to our nation, service as educators, as police officers, her brother who was with us serving in the military, people who've devoted their lives to the American cause, to improving and caring for other families and communities. And she is absolutely not an enabler of child abusers. One conservative prosecutor, Fox News opinion writer, said that these repeated assaults, mischaracterizing her entire character and record based on just a few sentencing decisions, are meritless to the point of demagoguery. That's an elegant way of saying worthless. Of the 100 offenders she sentenced, there have been just 5 cases for possession of child pornography, and in every case, she sent the offender to jail. As my colleague from Minnesota ably and thoroughly reviewed, she's in the mainstream of judges sentencing in these cases. I'll just add 2 more pieces of evidence to this ongoing debate, if I might. An ABC News review of federal judges appointed and confirmed during the previous administration found a dozen had handed down similar below-guideline sentences in cases of defendants who were charged with viewing, possessing, transporting, or distributing child pornography. The committee also received a letter from judges, 9 retired district court and circuit court judges, retired. This is affiliated with Harvard Law School. A letter that attests that her practice in sentencing, and let me read if I can, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson's record in individual cases is entirely consistent with the nationwide patterns described by the U.S. Sentencing Commission and what the DOJ prosecutors and U.S. Court probation departments recommended. To the extent she departed, it is well within the mainstream of what other judges were doing nationwide by judges appointed by both Republicans and Democrats. Finally, I thought this was in some ways the hardest to understand. Judge Jackson is not going to pack the Supreme Court. There were a whole series of efforts to ascribe to Judge Jackson the views of different advocacy organizations. And as Senator Whitehouse thoroughly, repeatedly, and actively has laid out, we have too many groups that are advocating and engaging in trying to pre-cook what our work is here on the Judiciary Committee by digging into backgrounds, by pre-packaging, by advertising, and by selling. We can and should make real progress in opening up these dark money groups by voting for the Disclose Act. If later this year, when we have a chance on the floor of the Senate, my colleagues refuse to vote so that the American people can know who's really funding all this stuff, then they don't really want to know the truth. There's a lot more that I could present this morning to lay out the truth behind all of these aggressive, and I would say often baseless, attacks on Judge Jackson. Sadly, I think the truth about this is less relevant because a principal goal here is about stirring up division and scoring political points. Instead of a conversation about the significance of Judge Jackson becoming the first black woman to sit on our nation's highest court, what it will mean to have a Supreme Court justice who's served as a trial judge for nearly a decade and as a federal public defender and as a private practitioner and as a clerk at all levels, what it will mean for her experiences, her life, her grounding, her faith, her character, to be part of the deliberation of our nation's highest court. Instead, sadly, we were treated to a series of, I think, meritless attacks that were more distraction than substance. So let me close, if I can, with just a few thoughts that I think matter as we move towards a vote. Judge Jackson testified she cares deeply about our Constitution and the rights that make us free. The truth of her statements borne out by her own life experiences, by her career in the law, her record on the bench, and her thoughtful and measured responses to all of our questions, even those presented in the most aggressive of styles. Her judicial methodology is rooted in her understanding that the role of a judge is a limited one. She is the kind of judge humble enough to know that the Constitution and the laws passed by Congress say what the law is, while judges have a limited role to decide questions based on the law and the facts presented. This nominee brings me joy and a sense of pride that as a nation we are moving in the right direction, based on our constant project of delivering an America that lives up to the aspirational words written by our founders. The Supreme Court decides cases that mean something, that have an impact in the lives of millions of Americans, that teach the world what our system of democracy and the rule of law can actually accomplish. And I think having her, as someone who served on the Sentencing Commission, as a trial court and appellate court judge, as a public defender, in that court will continue to improve our nation in ways we don't yet fully know, but where I have confidence that in her bones, she knows how important our Constitution and the rule of law are to securing liberty and equality before the law for every American. Mr. Chairman, I mentioned Ruby Bridges in my opening now a week ago. I had the honor of meeting Ruby Bridges when I was on a civil rights pilgrimage with the late Congressman John Lewis. What's always struck me about the painting that Norman Rockwell did of Ruby Bridges was that as a very young girl marching into school, that by an action of the United States Supreme Court was open to her for the first time. There were tomatoes and slurs on the wall behind her, and yet she held her chin high. She was straight, and she marched forward with a sense of confidence, despite just outside the frame of that painting there being a howling, angry mob. So, too, I found that Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson conducted herself in questioning here with her head held high, with a sense of confidence in our Constitution, in our democracy, and in the rule of law. Our role in confirming a justice to the highest court is among our most solemn obligations, and I am honored to vote in support of confirming Judge Jackson to be the next Associate Justice of our Supreme Court. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, thank you, Senator Coons. Senator Cotton.
You know, Democrats in the committee and Judge Jackson herself have repeatedly said that senators should look to her record to see what kind of justice she would be. So some of our Democratic colleagues now claim that it's engaging in conspiracy theories to dare to ask Judge Jackson about that very record. Her record and her answers are clear. Judge Jackson may be a fine woman, but she has built her career as a far-left activist, and that didn't change when she put on a black robe 10 years ago. In fact, Judge Jackson remains more of a defense attorney for criminals from the bench than a judge. Across the board, Judge Jackson's average sentences for criminals are 34% lighter than the national average for criminal cases, and 25% lighter than the average on her own old court, the D.C. District Court. And the child pornography cases are just the most sensational examples of her soft-on-crime attitude. In her hearing, she talked about how deeply disturbing these cases are and how she always gave the criminals a really serious talking to for their possession and distribution of videos of young children being sexually abused. But a serious lecture is not a serious sentence. These aren't just numbers, these are criminals with real victims. And they go on to victimize again because Judge Jackson lets them off early. One of those criminals was Wesley Hawkins, who was a serious child pornography offender that Judge Jackson let off easy. The sentencing guidelines recommended 8 to 10 years in prison, 8 to 10 years. Judge Jackson gave him just 3 months. And that's only 1/6 of what her own probation office recommended. And a few years later, when Hawkins would still have been in prison if she had followed the guidelines, he did something else that got him 6 more months in custody, twice the original sentence. When all 11 Republicans on this committee sent a letter asking for details of what happened, Judge Jackson refused to provide any further information. I guess so much for looking at her record. Of course, her leniency isn't limited to these child pornography cases. In 2017, Judge Jackson apologized. She apologized to a fentanyl kingpin with a history of drug trafficking because she couldn't find a way to give him less than the mandatory minimum sentence imposed by Congress. And she felt bad about being so mean to a fentanyl kingpin. A couple years later, though, she found a way to twist the law to resentence him below the mandatory minimum sentence by making the First Step Act retroactive, even though Congress had explicitly chosen not to make it retroactive. She also said that there were no victims in the case. Fentanyl trafficking is not a victimless crime, and anyone who doesn't understand that does not belong on the Supreme Court. Judge Jackson also granted compassionate release to a man who brutally murdered a deputy U.S. Marshal by shooting him on the steps of a church at a funeral. He was repeatedly denied parole, and in prison he had racked up infractions for things like threatening prison staff and possessing a dangerous weapon. Not exactly a reformed saint. Judge Jackson granted him compassionate release anyway because he had high blood pressure. In 2013, a sex offender had repeatedly raped his 13-year-old niece and was arrested for falsifying sex offender records to avoid telling the government where he was living, or that he was working at a daycare despite a restriction on his contact with children. The government asked for him to go to prison for 2 years. Judge Jackson gave him just 1 year. During that second year, when he should have been in prison, yes, he went on to try to rape again and then bribe the victim with $2,500 to recant her testimony. Judge Jackson habitually sympathizes with criminals over victims. These are just a few of the many cases in Judge Jackson's record that all make one thing clear. If you are a criminal, you would be lucky if your case is assigned to Judge Jackson. If you are the victim of a crime or anyone else seeking justice, you better hope your case got assigned somewhere else. As a trial judge, Judge Jackson could only give the benefit of the doubt to one criminal at a time. As a Supreme Court justice, she would be able to give the benefit to criminals nationwide in all cases. Let's consider her terrorism cases. She seems to have a real interest in helping terrorists. Now, it's true that you shouldn't judge a lawyer solely for taking on an unpopular case, and defending criminals doesn't necessarily make someone ineligible to be a judge. But during the Bush administration, representing terrorists was all the rage in liberal legal circles. These were not unpopular cases, but instead, lawyers at liberal law firms and public defender's office fought with each other to be able to work for these terrorists. Judge Jackson represented 4 terrorists as a public defender, one of whom she continued to represent in private practice. She also argued in favor of terrorists in 2 other cases in amicus briefs while in private practice. Her backers try to have it both ways. On the one hand, they say this is all just assigned work, but on the other hand, they celebrate her as a hero for volunteering for so-called assigned work. Well, whether it was assigned or volunteered, the fact that Judge Jackson didn't do a very good job. In 3 of the 4 cases, her filings were identical, word for word, comma for comma. She alleged identical facts and legal arguments in every one of those cases. The only differences was the swapped out name and case numbers. So let's look at those terrorists. One of her terrorist clients designed the prototype shoe bomb that was used in an unsuccessful attempt to blow up a passenger airplane. Another of her terrorist clients planned and executed a rocket attack on U.S. forces in Afghanistan, and another of her terrorist clients was arrested in a raid on an al-Qaeda explosive training camp. Yet in every case, she claimed that her clients had nothing to do with terrorism and had never been affiliated with al-Qaeda or the Taliban, despite having no reason to believe that her alleged facts, copied and pasted from one brief to the next, were true. Judge Jackson also has a habit of refusing to answer simple common sense questions in her hearing and in questions for the record. Famously, when Senator Blackburn asked her what a woman was, she claimed that she had no idea. I asked her who has more of a right to be in the United States, new American citizens who follow the rules, waited their turn and came the right way, or illegal aliens whose very first act in the United States was to break our laws and who continue breaking them every day that they remain here illegally. Judge Jackson declined to answer. And when I asked Judge Jackson whether releasing Guantanamo Bay terrorists would make us more safe or less safe, she again pretended to have no clue. And of course, she refused to take an opinion on court packing, unlike the justice she would replace, Stephen Breyer, or the sainted Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Judge Jackson plays ignorant not because she doesn't know these answers, but because her liberal judicial philosophy is based on denying reality and trying to invent a new reality through the brute force of will as a judge. Judge Jackson's attempts to invent a new reality demonstrate a willingness to skirt the law when it doesn't fit her preferred outcome. Not only did she engage in what the Sixth Circuit called an end run around Congress to make the First Step Act retroactively reduce the sentence of that fentanyl kingpin I mentioned earlier, she also worked hard to strike down a Trump administration policy of removing recently arrived illegal aliens. The law passed by Congress granted DHS, quote, sole and unreviewable discretion on the issue. But Judge Jackson inserted herself to strike down what she called, quote, a terrible proposal by DHS. As if it's the judge's place to decide what is and is not a terrible and that is why I will vote no on her nomination.
Senator Blumenthal.
Really judicious way to adopt my colleague's baseball analogy. We've seen not only wild pitches, but more than a few brushbacks and even some beanballs. And I think you have conducted these hearings in a way that encourages us to look at the truth and look at our role in history. We've seen a lot of merit. In fact, even this morning, nothing really new and nothing true in many of the attacks. The fact of the matter is that Republicans have repeatedly supported Trump-appointed nominees that had similar sentencing records as Judge Jackson. There are 6 of them in the record, but they've chosen to raise this hypocritical line of attack on the first black woman to be nominated to the Supreme Court. When these kinds of lies have become so blatant that even the right-wing media echo chamber can't support them with a straight face, it really is saying something. The latest Republican attacks in recent days continue that trend. Cherry-picking data and slanting analysis to try to disingenuously smear a distinguished jurist. We all recognize that child sexual abuse material is abhorrent. That's the reason why I have led bipartisan legislation with members of this committee to stop it and hold accountable anyone who would enable it, and we have voted unanimously to bring that legislation to the floor. The American people really are having nothing of these attacks. She has wowed America. Any of us going home over these past weekends have seen a standing ovation for Judge Jackson from the American people. And the reason is that her nomination will be historic. We are, in fact, making history. It is a joyous and exciting moment for all of America. Her nomination will make the Supreme Court look more like America and hopefully think more like America. It is, in effect, a giant leap into the present, because the present of America looks like Judge Jackson and a more diverse judiciary at every level that President Biden has sought to achieve. And we have supported in achieving on this committee. Representation matters. It matters for the legitimacy and credibility of our whole judicial system. Judges are the voice and face of justice in America. Their credibility matters. They have no armies. They have no police forces. They have no power of the purse. The United States Supreme Court depends on its credibility and the trust of the American people that it will think like they do. It is unelected, appointed for life, one of the most undemocratic kinds of institutions you could possibly imagine. And so, as excited and proud I am on this day, I also am sad that we are seeing this partisan divide on this committee and in this Congress on this extraordinarily well-qualified nominee. My colleague, Senator Cornyn, talked about legitimizing consent. Legitimizing consent means that the American people consent and legitimize the Supreme Court. If we treat the Supreme Court like another political branch, it will become one. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy, and right now we are fulfilling it. The United States Congress, and most especially my Republican colleagues, are fulfilling that prophecy by engaging in a party line vote against a nominee that is superbly qualified by character and intellect and will make history as the first black woman to be confirmed. Voting along strict party lines means it is more likely that the Supreme Court will vote that way too. Regardless of how the court votes go, the public will perceive the court as more political, more polarized, and less legitimate. The court has many self-inflicted wounds. The failure to adopt a code of ethics is one of them, and I have advocated that code of ethics, and I asked the nominee about it, and she said she would talk to her colleagues. But the partisan combat we're seeing today is a wound that the United States Congress inflicts on the court. Now, this nominee has an emotional intelligence in addition to legal intellect. She is a bridge builder. She aims at consensus. My colleagues question whether she had a judicial philosophy. Well, normally, the way you determine judicial philosophy is to look at decisions and opinions, not asking the judge to describe it. She has ruled for and against the Trump administration, for and against labor and collective bargaining, for against qualified immunity, for and against class certification, because her methodology is to follow the facts and the law. And as she said in Mobarez v. Kerry, where she declined to evaluate the plaintiff's claims because doing so would have required, quote, making and imposing policy judgments of her own about the wisdom and or reasonableness of decisions, end quote, she knows her lane. That's her methodology, to stay within the judicial lane. Finally, as to law enforcement, I found overwhelmingly persuasive her description of what it was like for her to grow up with members of her family involved in law enforcement. Her uncle, who was a chief of police, her brother, a cop on patrol. Quote, I'd make three observations in response to those critiques, meaning the critique of her law enforcement background. She said, the first is that as someone who has had family members on patrol and in the line of fire, I care deeply about public safety. I know what it's like to have loved ones who go off to protect and to serve, and the fear of not knowing whether or not they're going to come home again because of crime in the community. As you said, my brother patrolled the streets of Baltimore, and I had two uncles who were career law enforcement. She is someone who knows what it means to respect and enforce the law, and she has a respect for the law, not just words on the page, as my colleague, Senator Klobuchar, said so well. She has respect for the impact of the words of judges in opinions they write and what they speak in their courtroom, the effect and the impact on everyday Americans, just as Justice Breyer has done throughout his career. These abstract legalisms, the abstruse pronouncements from the bench, they affect everyday Americans. She knows it. And that's how she will make the Supreme Court think more like America. We are making history here, not only for ourselves, but for generations to come. Quote, one of the things that having diverse members of the court does is it provides for the opportunity for role models. Since I was nominated to this position, I've received so many notes and letters and photos from little girls around the country who tell me they are so excited for this opportunity and that they have thought about the law in new ways. All of America will think about the law and about the court in new ways. And little girls, women, all American will hopefully have more respect and trust for the courts. She is, as she said, standing on the shoulders of others who couldn't be here today. Constance Baker Motley, John Lewis, her parents, and thousands of others who fought, and some died, for changes in the laws so that we would think about the law in new ways, and she would become our first black woman on the United States Supreme Court. I will proudly vote for her. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank you for the way you've conducted these hearings. And also appreciate the hard work on the part of your staff, especially your Chief Nominations Counsel, Phil. Thank you all for the work you've done. As I said last week, I'm not going to be supporting Judge Jackson's nomination. I sat through the majority of the hearings a couple of weeks ago and submitted more than 300 questions for the record. I just have come down to believe that she may do the very thing I'm most concerned with, and that's rule on cases in a way that achieves a preferred policy outcome, not necessarily what the Constitution dictates. Probably the Make the Road case is probably the best example where the plain text of the statute was looked past. A nationwide injunction was imposed only to be struck down by the D.C. Circuit. But the other thing that makes me feel like it may come to pass that she does rule outside of the plain text of the Constitution or the law is the number of people who do support her that I take at face value what she said. I asked her if she had any connection with the Arabella Group or Demand Justice, some of these other radical liberal activist organizations. She said she didn't, but she's on their top pick list everywhere you go, whether it's Demand Justice, short list for President Biden, Sierra Club, a number of the other organizations within the Arabella radical liberal activist groups seem to think that she would be a good addition to the court. And their activist outcomes couldn't be further from what I want to see with respect to the future of our nation. But I'm also concerned that Judge Jackson wouldn't take a stand on my question about packing the court. Now, I know some people have said that Judge Barrett, now Justice Barrett, did not answer the question directly. It's a very different question now than it was when Judge Barrett was here. Because now we have these same groups, Demand Justice and others, they have organizations focused on nuking the filibuster. And on January the 19th, we came really close to doing that. And we all know that if that occurred, it laid the predicate for expanding the Supreme Court. I, for one, it won't be the sole factor, but I, for one, if I have an opportunity to sit on this committee and consider a future Supreme Court justice, it will be a weighted factor in my decision whether it's coming forward from a Democrat judge or a Republican judge with respect to being considered on the Supreme Court. I think a simple answer, very similar to what Justice Ginsburg and Justice Breyer done, would have been a great way to calm my fear about the worst possible thing. We could talk about these hearings being politicizing and divisive, but nothing would be more politicizing, divisive, and destructive to the Supreme Court than to expand it and pack it. So those and other reasons, including some of the responses to my more than 300 questions for the record, I'm not going to be supporting Judge Jackson. I am a realist. I know that she's going to be confirmed. I think we've had a colleague on our side of the aisle also announce support. And I just wish her family very well. I got an opportunity during one of the breaks to go up to her parents, and I told them that they clearly raised her right. I mean, she's the realization of an American dream, and they should be very proud, and the supporters here should be very proud of her. This is not about the content of her character. I think I judge that to be very strong. This has to do with future decisions where I believe, and I hope that I'm proven wrong, that Justice Jackson may go in a direction that runs counter to much of what we've talked about today. I will not be supporting her nomination, but I do wish her and her family well, and I look forward to maybe everyone listening to what they said today, and in the future, whether it's a Supreme Court hearing or a Circuit Court hearing, exercise some of those words with respect to our individual behavior and action. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Tillis. And now Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I welcome everyone in the audience here for this historic committee vote. Mr. Chairman, Judge Jackson withstood more than 18 hours of questioning during her nomination hearing. Most members asked her questions about her experience, record, and methodology for deciding cases. But some members took statements she had said or written out of context and tried to smear Judge Jackson with unfair and ugly accusations. As Senator Booker so aptly described it, Judge Jackson showed grit and grace through the entire hearing. She never returned these personal attacks. She gave substantive answers when it was possible and when senators gave her the opportunity to do so. And she corrected the attempts to distort and malign her record patiently and repeatedly. To highlight the misguided attacks around the sentencing of child pornography cases, I questioned Judge Jackson about the history of the sentencing guidelines for these crimes and the concerns that these guidelines do not reflect what's happening with child pornography offenses. And these facts bear repeating. A decade ago, the U.S. Sentencing Commission first addressed the issue of sentencing in this area. And even back then, only 40% of convicted offenders were receiving sentences within the guidelines. This was over 10 years ago. Now, 10 years later, even fewer offenders are receiving sentences within the guidelines. In 2019, just 30% of non-production offenders were sentenced within the guidelines. In the D.C. Circuit, where Judge Jackson served, the average goes down to just 20% of offenders. This puts Judge Jackson well within the mainstream. She is not an outlier. I named, and others on our side of the aisle, named numerous other judges nominated by President Trump and supported by the Republicans on this committee who have also sentenced offenders to sentences well below the guidelines. These judges also expressed concern about how the sentencing guidelines do not reflect the circumstances in the child pornography cases today. And this is not just a concern of the U.S. Sentencing Commission and the judges who must sentence criminal defendants. In 2013, just 1 year after the original U.S. Sentencing Commission report on this matter, the U.S. Department of Justice, who prosecutes these cases, stated that the guidelines for child pornography offenses do not accurately reflect the current landscape of child pornography conduct. Judge Jackson is a mainstream judge. She has issued decisions and sentences similar to other judges across this nation, regardless of which political party nominated that judge to the bench. And I just want to mention, we have said many times that Judge Jackson is in the mainstream. And I want to mention a nominee who has been brought up by Republicans as someone we should have supported. I take it because she was black. And this person, again, her name was brought up several times by Republican colleagues today, Janice Rogers Brown, a black nominee. And apparently it was for the proposition that the Democrats had a chance to support this judge because she's black, because they seem to be making the argument that that's why we Democrats are supporting Judge Jackson, not because Judge Jackson is so eminently qualified. I looked up some things that Janice Rogers Brown noted, and she gave a speech in the early 2000s when Democrats opposed her nomination. And it was because of her extreme ideology, because she wasn't in the mainstream. For example, in this speech that I'm referring to, before the Federalist Society, she railed against the role of government, claiming that government results in war in the streets, this is direct quoting, and families under siege, among other, I would say rather incendiary and extremist views. It was this extreme ideology that led to widespread opposition to Janice Rogers Brown's nomination to the D.C. Circuit, including from the Congressional Black Caucus, the NAACP, the Leadership Conference, and others. So the relentless, unfounded, and trumped-up attacks that Judge Jackson has faced, despite her exceptional qualifications, is nothing but a ruse, a campaign to give Republicans cover for voting against such an historic nominee because she is so highly qualified. I would like to refocus on what an exceptional and historic nominee Judge Jackson is. She has more judicial experience than 4 of the current justices had combined when they joined the court. She has broad support from across the political spectrum, including from prominent conservatives, federal judges appointed by Republican presidents, former Republican officials, and a bipartisan group of 86 former state attorneys general. Organizations from across the political spectrum and covering a wide range of issues support her, from the Black and Hispanic U.S. Chambers of Commerce and the National Education Association to the Fraternal Order of Police, the largest police union. She has been widely praised as being eminently qualified and having the intellect, the integrity, and the temperament befitting an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. It was also noted that the American Bar Association, when they testified that they had reached out to 2,800 judges and lawyers from all 50 states, all federal circuits, and all federal judicial districts, state Supreme Court justices, and law school deans, and every one of them uniformly had the highest praise for Judge Jackson. So the ABA Standing Committee gave Judge Jackson a unanimous. They don't often give someone unanimous, but they unanimously deemed Judge Jackson to be well qualified. And we all know about the methodology that she uses, because this constant request for what is your judicial philosophy, as though that is some sort of a North Star. Judicial philosophy is a tool. Her methodology enables her to come up with decisions that are fair and objective. And I don't know what else we would want of a justice of the Supreme Court. I just wanted to share, lastly, a comment I received about Judge Jackson's hearing, when her hearing concluded. During her nomination hearing, I asked Judge Jackson the same 2 questions on sexual assault and harassment that I ask of all nominees. In follow-up questioning, I named judges who had committed such misconduct and asked Judge Jackson what she does to ensure her court is a safe and inclusive place to work. After Judge Jackson's hearing concluded, a woman who had clerked for one of the judges I named as committing this kind of offense reached out to me. And during her clerkship, this young woman endured extreme and pervasive sexual harassment. She came forward publicly about this judge's conduct, and experiences she described as harrowing ordeals. And this woman went on to clerk for Judge Jackson. And in Judge Jackson's court, she said she was treated like a valued and talented employee who could make meaningful contributions to the law. And in fact, she credits Judge Jackson for her remaining as a lawyer. Mr. Chairman, thank you for letting me go over a little bit. This is the kind of human being, highly qualified person that we need on the United States Supreme Court. I am privileged to support her. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Hirono. Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I enjoyed the opportunity to meet with Judge Jackson in person several weeks ago. I found our exchanges here on the committee after almost an hour of questioning to be very substantive and very thorough, and based on the answers that I heard from her then and in response to my other colleagues, I can say definitively that I like her. I think she's a good person, but I cannot support her. And I want to say a word or two as to why. We heard from her, she told me this actually when we sat down together in our meeting, and she said it again under oath, that she has no particular judicial philosophy. She's said in response to questions that she has no view on whether or not people have natural rights. Curious. She told Senator Blackburn she can't define what a woman is, but the one thing that she seemed to be very comfortable saying quite definitively is that she thinks the U.S. federal sentencing guidelines for criminals are too harsh. She said it repeatedly here under oath. We've talked about it at length. Her record reflects it. And I just want to say that I agree with my Democrat colleagues on this point at least. When it comes to a judicial philosophy, it probably is true that the best way to ascertain a nominee's judicial philosophy is to look at their record. And for days, that is exactly what we have done. I sat with the nominee and went through 55 pages of transcripts in her cases. We talked about multiple cases. Other senators questioned her on this score as well. And when you look at her record in depth, her consistent policy position is that the federal sentencing guidelines are outdated, they are outmoded, they are too harsh, and that criminals in general are over-sentenced. And I just have to say, I couldn't disagree with her more. You know, she's very clear in her cases, and I commend the transcripts of her cases to everyone who is interested. If you read the transcripts of her cases, when she sentences criminals, and particularly in the child pornography cases that we've discussed so much, she routinely says that she has significant policy disagreements with the federal sentencing guidelines. She's very open about this. I mean, this isn't a secret. She's very open about it. And again, it's very clear in the child pornography cases in particular. This is why in 100% of those cases where she had discretion, 100% of the time, she sentenced below the federal sentencing guidelines, below the prosecutor's recommendations, and we now know frequently below what the probation office confidentially recommended. In the Hawkins case, in the Sears case, in the Kane case, in the Hilly case, we now know she recommended below or sentenced below what even the probation office recommended in their confidential reports to her, and she did it based on policy. And for me, this is very key. This is a very thoughtful person. Judge Jackson is not someone who's just wandered in here. She's very accomplished. She's very thoughtful. She was on the bench for 10 years, has been on the bench for 10 years, served on the Sentencing Commission before that. She's given these issues a great deal of thought. And I think that her views on these issues as it relates to sentencing and criminal justice are very well considered. I just disagree with them very fundamentally. Here's the policy that she discussed with us and that she has repeatedly discussed in her cases. She says that she disagrees on principle. When it comes to these child pornography cases, the criminals should be getting a higher sentence based on the number of images they possess. That's what the guidelines say. You should get a higher sentence based on the number of images. She repeatedly says, for the record in these cases, and she said it here to this committee, to me, to Senator Graham, to Senator Cruz and others, that she thinks that that is wrong as a matter of policy. I think that that is fundamentally mistaken. The more images there are, the worse the crime is. The number of children being sexually exploited and images made of child sexual exploitation isn't decreasing, it's exploding. In 2019, the New York Times reported after an investigative survey that there were 45 million images of children being sexually exploited on the internet. Last year, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children said that number was up to 85 million. 45 to 85 in the space of just 2 or 3 years. I just disagree with Judge Jackson when she says that we shouldn't be sentencing criminals based on the number of images they possess. I think in this age, in this set of circumstances, she's fundamentally wrong and the guidelines are right. She says that she disagrees on principle with the enhancement for using the computer, using the internet. She made that very clear. She says it in the cases over and over. Fair enough, but I think she's wrong. In an age when child exploitation is driven by these images that are exploited, are distributed through the internet, through computers, to set aside computer use as a reason to give a higher sentence, to ignore the guidelines on this, I think is a mistake. I think it is a very fundamental mistake. She said that she doesn't give enhancements based on the sadistic nature of the images. She said that over and over in the cases we looked at. In the Hawkins case, she says it. In the Cooper case, she says it. I also think that that is fundamentally mistaken as a matter of substantive policy. I do think that if you have a criminal defendant who possesses images that are sadistic in nature, where children, babies, are being sadistically sexually abused, that person ought to spend more time in jail. I do think that is worse than a criminal of another variety, of another type. And I'm not the only one. Prosecutors, including a prosecutor who testified to us 2 weeks ago, who are experts in human trafficking, have made the same point. This prosecutor who was before us here on the committee, she spent 18 years prosecuting these crimes. Her testimony was an offense that involves a computer is worse than an offense that involves the mail. An offense that involves more images is worse than an offense that involves fewer. An offense that involves young children is worse than an offense involving older children. Judge Jackson's view is that we should treat everyone more leniently because more and more people are committing worse and worse child sex offenses. I'd say exactly the opposite is what we should be doing. If more people are committing worse child sex offenses, if there are more images, if the images are more graphic and exploitative in nature, then more people ought to be spending more time behind bars. And here again, I would submit to you that her judicial philosophy on this point is why she is consistently sentenced below not just the guidelines, not just the prosecutors, but as we have seen, the national average in these cases, and even below her colleagues in the D.C. Circuit. And by the way, Judge Jackson's aware of this. If you look at the transcripts of her cases, Judge Jackson, to her credit, by the way, she's very thorough. Judge Jackson frequently will ask the U.S. Sentencing Commission for data on what the averages are for this kind of a crime in other courts and in her court. In the Cooper case, for instance, Judge Jackson, this is another one of the child porn cases, Judge Jackson looked to statistics about the average sentence given to similarly situated defendants. She asked the Sentencing Commission to calculate this. Her own statistics, or really the Sentencing Commission statistics, revealed that she sentenced Cooper, in this case the defendant, to 41 months below the national average. I know that because she knows it. She cites it. It's in the transcript. Here's my point. Judge Jackson, as a matter of policy, sentences below the national averages, below her colleagues, and by the way, the prosecutors know it. Read the transcripts. The prosecutors come into court, and when they appear before her, they say, Judge, we know that you have policy disagreements with the guidelines. We know that you think they over-sentence. We know you think they're too harsh. They know it. They argue with her based on it. Some cases pleading with her, at least give the defendants. In the Hawkins case, this is the 18-year-old who had thousands of images, all those videos of young children. They plead with her, at least give him 2 years. That was below the guidelines. At least give him 2 years. She gave him 3 months. I think this is why, this core judicial philosophy is why we see her doing things like apologizing to some of these offenders, just like she apologized to Wesley Hawkins. She said she was sorry for him. Now listen, I just have to say, I'm not sorry for him. I'm not sorry for these offenders. I am not sorry for the offenses they have committed and where they have gotten themselves to. They should go to jail. They should go to prison. And my fundamental disagreement with Judge Jackson is not based on her character or her integrity or her accomplishments. I think those things are beyond question. It's based on her policy and her philosophy. And I think on these core issues, she is just dead wrong. Now let me just say this finally in conclusion. We've heard in Judge Jackson's defense, and I don't know it's really much of a defense. I know she didn't say these things, but in her defense by the White House and members of this committee, we've been told things like the child pornography is actually all a conspiracy. It's not real. It's just a conspiracy. It's made up. Let me just say for the record, sex crimes against children are not fiction. They are not a conspiracy. There are 85 million images of children being exploited available on the internet. I'm a former prosecutor. These are real crimes. I'm a father of 3 young children. These are real children. And these aren't victimless crimes. Just because they're images doesn't mean real kids aren't involved. As we heard testimony from prosecutors and experts just 2 weeks ago, child pornography creates a cycle of trafficking, of exploitation, of abuse. It is the children here who are the victims, not the criminals. On that core point, I disagree fundamentally with Judge Jackson. I wish her well, but I cannot support her nomination. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Booker.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and the ranking member for doing everything you could to have a good hearing. And I really mean that, Mr. Chairman. You have been, to me, one of the great mentors of mine in the Senate, but watching you here is the best of Durban, your best hits, I think, in trying to do this. And I will say to the guy you're smiling at right now, I don't know if I help you or hurt you when I say such nice things about you, sir, but you are a gentleman. I spent a lot of time in Iowa, and you exemplify Iowa nice, and I appreciate the way you've done it. This has been an interesting experience. I often think maybe we should be holding this hearing during December because, Mr. Chairman, I don't know if you know about the vaunted holiday of Festivus, which is the holiday for the rest of us during the holidays. And one of the aspects of Festivus is the airing of grievances. And I think that we've had probably the best Festivus celebration here in this hearing over the last week or so because there's been a lot of airing of grievances. Now, I'm one of these people that thinks that there's no false equivalency here, that the grievances that I've seen since I've been here from the ridiculousness of Merrick Garland and when he was nominated, not even having a hearing, not even meeting with him, or even some of the language. I recently looked at the quote, one of the quotes from one of the people on this committee on the Republican side, who talked about if Hillary Clinton won, we should just leave any Supreme Court vacancies if the Republicans control the court. But I'm also self-interrogated enough to know that I shouldn't just sit here and air my grievances and listen to their grievances. And that's why I'm really appreciative of Ben Sass, Senator Sass, and I think the Oxford English Dictionary is now a new word for next year, jackassery. I want to thank Tom Tillis. I don't, again, agree with his equivalencies on everything, but I see an earnest person trying to figure out how we can make sense of this place and return more to patriotism, less towards partisanship. And I've listened to every time he spoke, he's made appeals to those higher angels, and I'm grateful for that. I really do worry about where we are spiraling towards. I worry about hearings like this, where the majority of people on both sides, I think, were well within the zone, but I heard things that were just ridiculous and painful and hurtful. And I do worry, and I hope that maybe when the cameras are off and some of us can get together and talk about how do we repair and how do we heal. I have not resigned myself to the inevitability of this is where the United States Senate is going. And the collateral damage to this, and it's not all us, I think the Supreme Court has done enough damage to itself with its lax ethics rules, but the legitimacy of the court has sunk pretty dramatically over the last years, and I think a lot of it is because of the spectacle that we've seen here and now, and that really concerns me. Look, I think it was I know it was President Lincoln who said, "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here," and I know that's from my words as well. This is a frustrating experience to see this happen. But I want to make a couple points and then shift to my final point. I think we do real damage to our own agendas here as elected leaders when we so vilify each other that we create these caricatures. I made the mistake in one Supreme Court hearing, and it was not intentional, but even when it came out of my mouth, in talking about a Supreme Court justice, I used the word evil. I did not intend to do it, and if context, I think, might save me, but how horrible it is to describe another human being with terms like I've heard here, evil. I remember my governor, who was a Republican, my friend, was running for president, and the right had so vilified Obama, had so dehumanized him, that when my governor and Obama hugged after a natural disaster, it was used in campaign commercials against my governor, and he dropped over 10 points because he did the sin of somebody that we had so vilified, so demonized, that human interaction, that a hug is such a violation of our tribe that it actually hurt them. I sometimes see some of my friends that might run for president on the other side. I think I might foil their campaigns by going around hugging them. Because that's where we've gotten in America right now. We have so vilified each other. And that's why I just want to address the absurdity of the vilification of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. Even the rhetoric I've heard used here, I kept writing things down. Judge Jackson is not an extremist. She is not out of the judicial norm. I've heard language, I won't read through all the attacks on her that I've heard in this hearing today, not to mention the previous days. I'm sorry, who does the American public want to believe? A bunch of elected senators or the independent folks are out there? To say she's an extremist on crime belies the fact that she has law enforcement group after law enforcement group supporting her. So if you want to say that she is an extremistly soft on crime, then you're saying that FOP, you're saying that about the IACP. Go through all the organizations. If I hear another person trying to wrap themselves in the obvious that all 22 of us find abhorrent sexual crimes and somehow want to glorify themselves to being, hey, I'm a prosecutor. Well, both people on both sides. I got my back full of prosecutors over here. And I see noble people that did the Lord's work of prosecuting these crimes as well. But here's the absurdity to say that somehow she is not strong against these cases. Again, these are just lies. Again, a senator just said, I believe the guidelines are right. Well, obviously, Republican-appointed judges don't agree with him, because the norm in many states is 70 to 80% of judges going before the guideline. And if that statement is correct, then why didn't you vote against every one of those Republican judges that was not following the guidelines, as most don't? You could try to create a straw man here, but it does not hold. And it's just frustrating to me to listen to people trying to create a caricature of a human being whose family is law enforcement, who is a parent, and who is well within the norm on these cases. And again, I'm an elected official just like my colleagues on the other side, so don't believe me. Believe all the victims' rights advocates that have written in on this issue. There are organizations that represent hundreds and hundreds of organizations on victims of sexual assault, women and children. I don't need to read the horrific stuff that they deal with every single day, but God bless America. The National Children's Alliance, a national organization that works on behalf of children who have been sexually abused. They have 924 member organizations. All would concur with the a conservative magazine that called what my colleague, Senator Hawley, is saying, that these things that he's saying are meritless, on the verge of demagoguery. And so I could go through all the things that balance the world out here, because you come in here and the way we talk about each other, the way we talk about a justice is so disrespectful. I respect the criticisms. I voted against Amy Coney Barrett. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but the way we talk about each other, the rhetoric that is so disrespectful, so much of a caricature, so far out of the lines of what independent groups and law enforcement and victim advocacies that support this candidate would say. Which brings me to the final point I want to make. I am hearing from people, not just black women, but particularly black women, who have been relating to me their stories about having to come into a room where you're more qualified than the people who are sitting in judgment of you, and having to endure the absurdities of disrespect that we saw Judge Jackson endure. The stories I'm hearing are replete from folks in all kind of jobs and all kind of experiences in their lives who are so qualified, so worthy, and what they've had to endure. And that's what struck a chord this week. I don't think, again, we are going to have our political substantive disagreements, but it was the treatment in some of these questions that triggered a hurt in so many people I know and have encountered. How could they create these caricatures? How could they create these exaggerations? How could they disrespect a person like her who's done everything right in her life and in her journey? How? How qualified do you have to be, double Harvard? How qualified do you have to be clerking at all levels of the federal judiciary? How qualified do you have to be 3 times confirmed by the Senate in a bipartisan manner? And so, Senate, I have to say, today is the birthday of a great poet named Maya Angelou. And so I'm just going to end with those words. Why does this poem strike a chord with so many Americans? Because they feel it to their bones. And so this is in honor of Maya Angelou and the next Supreme Court Justice of the United States of America. Happy birthday, Maya, Dr. Angelou. You may try to write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me down in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I rise. Rise, Sister Jackson. Rise, Judge Jackson, all the way to the highest court in the land. And when we have that final vote, I will rejoice, ancestors will rejoice, and we will say, Lord, this is a day that you have made. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Booker. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we all appreciate having had the nominees' time and her willingness to meet with us. And I think we all enjoyed meeting her family. And indeed, she has a very impressive resume. She has worked hard to build that, but our concerns and our disagreements do lie with how she has addressed child pornography, how she has addressed her sentencing practices, her release policies, her work with terrorists, her work with agencies, overreach that is there, and indeed her immigration policies. And I want to talk a little bit about one of the exchanges that I had with her. I did ask her about the United States versus Virginia case. That was the Supreme Court's landmark women's rights case, and it did strike down VMI's male-only admission policy. Now, I'm not an attorney, but I understand from so many attorneys that this is a case that anyone, first-year law school, would be familiar with. They would know this case, but Judge Jackson claimed not to be familiar with the case, so I asked her whether she agreed with Justice Ginsburg in that case that there are physical differences between men and women that are enduring, and she refused to answer. So then I asked her a very simple question. I asked her to define the word woman. Wasn't a trick question. It's something that everybody learned in grade school science class. But Judge Jackson refused to answer. The fact that she couldn't or wouldn't answer that question speaks volumes. It tells me that Judge Jackson is beholden to the radical left that is teaching our children that they can choose their own sex. It tells me that she is more committed to woke progressive ideology than she is to common sense and the rule of law. And it tells me that she will not be able to decide with impartiality the cases that are sure to come before her as a Supreme Court justice. How, for example, will Judge Jackson be able to resolve sex discrimination claims if she can't decide whether the parties before her are women? How can she decide Title IX cases if she doesn't even agree with Justice Ginsburg that there are enduring physical differences between men and women? We recently saw a Ninth Circuit judge issue a written opinion stating that, and I'm quoting, "People of all genders can become pregnant," end quote. And disputes over biological males competing in women's sports are working their way through the federal courts. How can a Judge Jackson decide any of these issues as a Supreme Court justice if she is too afraid of the radical left to give this committee a definition of the word woman? Judge Jackson's refusal to answer my question underscores the dangers of the kind of progressive ideology that she endorses. In the time since Judge Jackson sat before this committee, Disney has eliminated saying boys and girls. The State Department announced you can select X as a gender on your passport. The TSA will implement gender-neutral security screenings. The left has slowly but surely stripped words of their meaning in an attempt to eliminate dissent. And the latest victim of this campaign is the word woman. Americans from across the political spectrum want a Supreme Court justice who isn't divorced from reality, who has common sense, and who will protect their children and their right to rear their children as they see fit. Parents live in fear of the progressive ideology that is being pushed in some of our schools. I hear from them regularly. But Judge Jackson's answer to my question made perfectly clear to me and to everyone watching that she will be a certain vote for government overreach in private family decisions. She has written, and I'm quoting her, these are her words, that every judge has personal hidden agendas, end quote. That influences the cases they decide. While that may not be true for all judges, it is of concern at many cases, and it is of concern that this is her view. This hearing, the judge's record, have made it clear that she will interpret the Constitution through the lens of progressive ideology. Her refusal to define a simple word, woman, is only one example of many. Another is her desire to make excuses for some of society's worst offenders. She has suggested that we are too tough on child predators, and as a judge, she has ensured that these offenders receive some of the lightest sentences possible. She serves on the board of a K-12 school that teaches kindergartners that they can choose their own sex and teaches them about so-called white privilege. And she has praised the now discredited 1619 Project and has stated that judges should consider critical race theory in sentencing criminal defendants. This hearing has revealed the extent of her personal hidden agenda, which explains why she is the favorite pick of some of the radical left dark money groups. But the role of a Supreme Court justice is to interpret the law, not to take up arms in a culture war. She promised the committee that she would decide cases from a neutral posture and that she would rule consistent with her judicial oath. While she may be sincere in that pledge, I still have concerns that her ideology may influence her jurisprudence. As I told her, her primary commitment must be to the Constitution, not progressivism. For those reasons, I am certainly going to vote no for Judge Jackson. Before I close, Mr. Chairman, I did want to address a point of process. You have repeatedly dressed down my Republican colleagues and me for asking Judge Jackson tough questions. You did it throughout the hearings, you did it at last week's markup, and you've done it repeatedly in the media, including before we even had a chance to ask a question. You called our questions vile, baseless, and imputed dishonorable motives to us. My colleagues and I expressed legitimate concern that Judge Jackson sentenced child pornography offenders to less prison time than the national average. Judge Jackson and my Democrat colleagues claimed that the probation reports justified her decision, so we asked to see them. It was a reasonable request, but you responded by insinuating that we wanted to hurt children, and you specifically questioned why I, as a mother, would take that position. That was a surprising comment. We want to make one thing clear. Questions are not attacks. Confirming a Supreme Court justice is one of our most important duties as United States Senators. This is a lifetime appointment, and it would be a dereliction of duty to our constituents not to ask tough questions.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Since you raised a question about me personally, I'm going to respond personally. And I would just tell you that I have said repeatedly and will repeat at this moment, the majority of questions coming from the Republican side of the aisle were fair, respectful, and asked tough questions because that's what we're here for, to ask tough questions about somebody aspiring to a lifetime appointment to the highest court in the land. I took exception to several of my Republican friends. I never named a name, so if anyone took it personally, that's their decision. If the shoe fits, I think they went too far. And I think some of the things they said about this judge don't reflect the reality of who she is and what she has accomplished in her life. And I think it was my responsibility to try to keep us on the straight path of judging her in a fair manner. The point about pre-sentencing reports, I will repeat so there's no question. This Judiciary Committee has never requested pre-sentencing reports. And I was not going to be party to that effort that some of them suggested in writing to me. I then spoke to several Republican senators, and we talked about the details, and they said, oh, I didn't realize that's what we were asking for. You're right, we shouldn't get those reports. Why? Those reports are created by courts to sentence an individual. They are confidential in nature. They interrogate not only the defendant, but they interrogate a lot of innocent third parties, even children who are survivors. They come up with information which is seen only by a judge, as it should be. And they have to realize that what they say about the defendant or about the defendant's family or their relationship with them, and some of it can be very personal and very specific, is never expected to leave the courthouse and find its way into this committee. I'm just not going to be party to that, Senator. I'm sorry. I said it clearly. I'll repeat it again. I'm not going to have it weigh on my conscience that a mother of a child who's been exploited lives in fear that that pre-sentencing report, which she thought was confidential, is not. Too much to ask. We've got plenty of information to go on around here. And I don't think we should ever consider that. I will vote against it consistently, whoever's in the chair, Democrat or Republican. Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Grassley, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening and leading and at times moderating these proceedings. It has been a real honor on behalf of my constituents in Georgia to participate in this process. And there are few nominations as significant or as deserving of seriousness of purpose, due diligence, and hard work on our part as senators than a lifetime appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court. I have approached these proceedings acutely conscious of the gravity of our obligation to do our constitutional duty, as my constituents in Georgia expect. And I entered this process with an open mind. I met at length with the nominee in private. My staff and I reviewed her record and writings and qualifications in detail. I had the opportunity to ask questions of Judge Jackson for nearly an hour in the several days of public proceedings that we held here in the committee. And you know, as a new member of the committee, Mr. Chairman, I'll confess that some of the back and forth about process and precedents dating back decades was new for me. And it's clear that there are some hurt feelings, some grudges that members of the committee may be nursing. And I understand that. But we're tasked with something extraordinarily important here. And at its best, these proceedings should be a pinnacle for the Senate, a moment when we come together in public and we grapple with some of the basic principles of constitutional law. We subject a nominee for the highest court in the land to tough but fair questioning about their qualifications, their approach to the law. And so again, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for consistently working to elevate these proceedings to their highest purpose. While she was testifying before the committee, I asked Judge Jackson about her approach to freedoms of speech, of assembly, to her understanding of the historical roots and significance of the First Amendment protection of the free exercise of religion. Engage with Judge Jackson to understand her approach to the Fourth Amendment, protections against unreasonable searches and seizures, and how she would approach such cases as new technologies present the court with new facts and circumstances. I engaged with the nominee about the Sixth Amendment right to counsel, the Gideon v. Wainwright decision, and her experience as a federal defender. We discussed the separation of powers, her understanding of the constitutional history and her approach to questions of the constraint of governmental and executive power. Throughout this process, I have been deeply impressed by Judge Jackson's professionalism, by her depth of knowledge, by her deep understanding of relevant case law, and by the seriousness with which she approaches her duties as a judge. Her record is one where she's ruled for labor and she's ruled for management. She's ruled for the Trump administration. She's ruled against the Trump administration. She's ruled for business. She's ruled for environmentalists. She's ruled in ways that would make liberal members of Congress happy and rules that would make conservative members of Congress happy. Without regard for her personal preferences, she has applied the law, and she walked us through the methodology by which she ensures that she arrives at neutral, fair, and impartial decisions. She conducted herself with great poise and strength and grace while under heavy questioning and at times attacks that, in my view, were cruel and unfair. And we had the opportunity, thanks to you, Mr. Chairman, to question independent, nonpartisan investigators from the American Bar Association who testified under oath that in the course of interviewing her colleagues from the bench and the bar, folks she had worked with throughout her life, undertaking a systematic review of her writings and decisional history, that they found no derogatory information whatsoever that raised concerns about her integrity, her impartiality, or her credibility, and in fact, that she has a sterling reputation with colleagues, whether they were arguing against her, whether she ruled for them or against her, throughout a legal career where she has built impeccable qualifications. She's worked as a federal defender. She'll bring that unique perspective to the Supreme Court. She's worked in private practice as a litigator. She's served as a federal judge at the district and appellate levels. And throughout her career, she has not just favorably impressed, but demonstrated superb and exceptional professionalism and capabilities, and that came through in the work that the ABA investigators did in reviewing her record. Mr. Chairman, Judge Jackson is poised now to make American history and to demonstrate to our fellow Americans and to the world what this country stands for at its very best. She has earned the respect of the nation through her exemplary conduct throughout this process. She will be a superb addition to the U.S. Supreme Court, and I look forward to enthusiastically voting to move her to the floor today and supporting her on the floor. And I thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for the privilege of being a part of these proceedings.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Men are free. The author of this quotation today would probably say people are free. And human life begins on the far side of despair. That, of course, is a famous quotation from a preeminent 20th century French philosopher. That philosopher went on to say, in another way, to be is to act. In other words, all we are, from at least one perspective, is the sum of our actions. Put yet another way, what you do is what you believe, and everything else is just cottage cheese. I found Judge Jackson to be smart, well-versed in the law, and how can I put this, extraordinarily deft and artful in her ability to speak at length without saying anything of substance on critical questions, especially the limits of judicial power and the importance of judicial restraint. That is not a characteristic solely of Judge Jackson's testimony. It seems that many of our nominees, not just for the United States Supreme Court, have adopted that approach for some time under other administrations. I regret that. For that reason, I spent a lot of time reading Judge Jackson's opinions. She hasn't written a lot of law review articles. That's not a criticism. She just hasn't. And I did take a look at the piece she wrote when she was much younger. But given the length of time, I put more emphasis on reading her opinions. And my conclusion is, and I think the best evidence of that, if you take a look at, read one opinion by the judge, I would encourage you to read Make the Road New York case, which was her case on immigration. Well written, but I think her true feelings about the limits of judicial power are expressed in that opinion. She was reversed by the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. I don't agree with the judge on where, based on her opinion, she draws the limits of judicial power, and I don't think she places as great an importance as I do on judicial restraint in a Madisonian system of checks and balances and separation of powers, and for that reason I will be voting no. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Let me say a few words about where we stand in the committee. I don't think there's anyone else who's not been recognized. At this point, every senator in attendance has had the opportunity to speak. We have a problem, and it could have happened to any one of us. One of our colleagues, Senator Padilla, got on the overnight special out of Los Angeles last night, took off, and a medical emergency on the airplane forced them back to Los Angeles. And so there he was. Were pending before the committee. I will keep you posted through your staff as to the progress that he's making in his return. He thought he'd done everything right. He put his whole family on the plane last night, and they all were brought back to Los Angeles. I know it troubles him, it pains him not to be here. So that is the circumstance. And if nothing further comes before the committee.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Lee.
I just wanted to respond very briefly to a conversation we had about pre-sentence reports a moment ago. I want to be very clear. Not one of us has suggested that any PSR should be released to the public. What we have said is that she made them relevant. She opened the door to them by saying that it was necessary to understand how she imposed sentences in those cases. That it would be apparent if we could see everything, including the pre-sentence report. So she opened the door to that, making them relevant. Not one of us has suggested that those ought to be publicly disclosed. Having handled those at previous stages of my career, I know they are sensitive. I also know that we, as a committee, have handled documents that are sensitive before. We could review them in a SCIF, treat them as classified, just as we have on countless occasions treated other sensitive documents that way. To the extent that the circumstances require it, we could even redact out victim names and replace them with John Doe 1, 2, and 3 or Jane Doe 1, 2, and 3 references. There's no reason why we couldn't review those. And it's, in any event, it's not fair. It's not a correct characterization to suggest that the decision is whether to make them public or leave them private. We're not arguing for that. We never have.
Senator, that issue has been debated, and I'm glad to give you your point of view to express. But I just want to tell you, not on my watch. Not on my watch. Some mother protecting that child is not going to understand redaction and the oath to keep things secret in the United States Senate. I'm sorry. I'm not going to be the first senator to open up that door. I think too much of the process and the promise of confidentiality to do it, nor do I think it's necessary to judge this judicial nominee. So if there's nothing further, I'd ask that the committee stand in recess subject to the call of the chair.